Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 150, Connie Hawkins. Author Mark Whited, whose book about the ABA's Pittsburgh Pipers will soon be hitting bookstores, and who talks so much about Hawkins in his book, will join me on today's show along with the grandson of Connie Hawkins, Sean Hawkins. Unfortunately, however, midway through our session, we experienced technical difficulties. So while Sean is on board for the first half of today's show, I was only able to connect with Mark to cover the last half of today's show. Nonetheless, today's subject, Connie Hawkins, is a fascinating story. A high school legend in New York City, he was recruited by Iowa and was on his way to a potential phenomenal NCAA career with the Hawkeyes before he was wrongly accused of being caught up in a point-shaving scandal and his career was sent off the rails. He was dismissed from Iowa, wound up playing in the American Basketball League with the Pittsburgh Rens, then the Harlem Globetrotters, then the ABA, the American Basketball Association, with the Pittsburgh Pipers, who later moved to Minnesota, and then finally the NBA, where he took off with the Phoenix Suns and put on a display that demonstrated just how good he was and showed the world what the NBA missed when it wrongfully banned him from the league. Before we get there, though, as always, please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Look for our page on Facebook, and if you want to reach out with a question, a comment, have a suggestion for another show, please send me an email, sportsfh.info@gmail.com. That's sportsfh.info@gmail.com. And please, if you can, right here, while you are watching, give Sports Forgotten Heroes a like and subscribe as well. Thank you for your support. Okay, let's get into today's show with my guests, Mark Whited and Sean Hawkins, as we discuss the great career of Connie Hawkins. Mark, Sean, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. Mark, glad to have you back. Sean, pleasure to meet you. There are so many different directions. I guess, Mark, this might be more aimed at you. There are so many different directions we can take today's show. We can talk about the Pipers. We've already done that. We could talk about Connie's career in the ABA. We could talk about his career in the NBA. We could talk about his career with the Harlem Globetrotters, the scandal, and some of these are going to intertwine today. But one thing we really can't talk about is his college career. I know this is somewhat of a loaded question, especially to start off with. And I don't want to get too deep because we do want to concentrate on his playing career. But why can't we talk about Connie Hawkins' college career that started at Iowa and never developed? What was the determining factor that prevented him from playing?
Well, when he played his freshman year, of course, back then freshmen couldn't play on the varsity team. He couldn't play beyond that because right as his freshman year was ending, that scandal broke out, and the point shaving scandal of 1961, and in March is when it broke out, and then it was the end of April that the New York District Attorney's Office sent a detective to Iowa, which they really had no justification for because he couldn't have thrown a game if he wanted to throw a game. He was a freshman. And so the scandal broke out. They sent him out, a detective out to interrogate Sean, or
Not me, hopefully not. Look.
Connie. And what had happened was Jack Molinas, who was the ringleader of the scandal, was in the process of trying to recruit him, but as he had quite the grooming methods, Jack Molinas, and because he had been an NBA player himself, he was able to get in his car and go play with players around the playgrounds of New York City. But there was no, Connie Hawkins was not part of, he had not said, gee, yeah, I'm gonna shave games for you. No, that hadn't happened. But what happened was, at Christmas time, Connie went back to New York, and he see at Iowa, since Connie didn't have a scholarship, he was since he didn't have a scholarship, they literally paid him under the table to pay his tuition, and they had a set up job for him, but that job, was kind of like cleaning the beach in the farms, right?
Yeah.
At a tire store. So anyway, he went back to New York, and the mistake they made, or what was made there, is the guy at the tire shop gave him the $200 for his next tuition, his next term. Well, he kind of spent it all on going out with friends and Christmas shopping and such. So by the time it was time to go back to Iowa, he had no money. And so he asked Jack Molinas for a loan, which he gave him $200 loan, which his brother, Connie's brother, paid back within a month. But so the reason that even a detective went out there is one of the fixers themselves was trying to save his butt, and he made up a story that Jack Molinas had and Joe Hacken was the other fixer, that they had Connie in the bag. Well, they didn't have him in the bag. It would have been stupid for them to pull him into things before he started playing varsity anyway. So what happened was he was interrogated for 2 weeks, and then he admitted everything, including the great train robbery, just to get out of there. If he'd have stuck with his story, which he did for the first 6 days, then his story was the real story, but they kept interrogating him without any opportunity for a phone call or to talk to a lawyer. And so he just told them what they thought they wanted to hear. So thus he goes back to Iowa. Iowa panicked. Connie was never charged with anything. It was obvious he really didn't do anything. They tried to say he was associated and introduced other players, but that did not even happen. So what Iowa did was, in a panic, they expelled him. Well, actually, they forced him to quit, and they were more concerned about all the recruiting violations. That's why they panicked and had him forced him to quit. So thus, he never played a varsity game, and he was immediately, fortunately, the coach wrote a good note. Well, fortunately, the American Basketball League was forming.
We'll get there in a second. Before we get there, I want to stick with college for a moment. Sean, do you recall any conversations around your household when you were growing up and hearing stories about the disappointment of not being able to play college basketball?
Oh man, definitely did that part of it. I see and let me kind of circle, I guess, and bring it all to like from school. What's the name? Hawkeyes. Like, something like, you can't write this up. Like, you know what I mean?
Don't forget
and
Hawkins
literally,
Street.
that's
Remember that?
yeah. I'm trying to get into that. Yeah. So you know what I mean. They had streets and stuff named after him, and had several things that really kind of coincide with where he, where he was headed and where he was trying to get to, and what his aim would have been, especially with him growing up uneducated. He couldn't read or write. That was one of the things growing up in the Harlem streets of Brooklyn. He grew up humble beginnings, same way. In those times, probably a little bit different of a struggle during those times where it was hard to educate yourself. You know what I mean? During those times, that was the threat of people being able to read and write being a threat. And him being a taller athlete, being able to, run, jump, and shoot, was a talent that, he was blessed with, it being a phenom, because none of his brothers or sisters were built like him. He was the only one that was shaped like that. So you knew he was built to do those things, like play basketball, because he was gifted in a way that, there's, just still till today, he's probably, top 5 for biggest hands, longest reach, and for somebody talking about played in the 60s, still be top 5 in those categories. Let you know he was the prototype. It's like, and to more so to say that, to tie everything into seeing that where he was going college wise, then I graduate from college, my career. He watched me go through. So in the household, when we used to talk about college and things that come up, he'd always talk about where he didn't get that opportunity to. So it was so huge when I was able to get my, go walk across the stage, get my degree. It was huge to him. Like, it meant a lot to him. He came out, supported. He was at all my games that year, my senior year. So it was huge. It was monumental, and I know it meant a lot to him because he showed it with his actions and the things that he did. So it always aligned up with the things that happened during our household when, growing up, that he wanted to further the generation. He wanted it to be better. So he wanted me to get a degree where he wasn't able to. He wanted to be able to say his grandson did.
It's awesome. He grew up in New York, Brooklyn, dominated in high school basketball. I think he went to boys high school. They won the city championship
twice.
But he also played.
He won the city championship twice.
And he also twice won the city championship in a high school, the high school city championship. But he also played at the famous Rucker Park. I don't know if people can really understand just how competitive basketball was, and still is in New York City. The competition, some of the other people that grew up and played basketball in New York City, how does playing basketball, and I don't want to compare it, I guess, and degrade basketball in any other section of the country, but how does playing basketball in New York City, in the playground, at a place like Rucker Park, how does that prepare you for college and a professional career, that kind of competition?
So New York City is considered the mecca of basketball. People like Tiny Archibald, Pee Wee Kirkland, that's what they told me, and any of my research says the same thing. Connie Hawkins, so at the mecca of basketball, which is New York City, I have a chapter talking about the two temples at the mecca, in the mecca of basketball. Those two temples were the Park and Madison Square Garden. So before Connie Hawkins left New York for Iowa, he was a legend at both of those temples. In fact, he was a legend at Rucker Park before he ever started a game in high school. The summer he turned 16, which was the summer of 1958, actually he started playing there the summer before and started playing against people like Cy Green and some others. But the summer of 1958 is when he was already one of the legends at Rucker Park, and that was the summer he turned 16. All right. So then he goes to boys high school. And one of the great things about Connie, he wasn't just a great scorer, but he learned at an early age how to pass really well. He had no problem passing. So his junior year was Billy Burwell's senior year. And Billy Burwell was the stud of the team. Connie was actually better, but that junior year he was content to clean, as they say, clean up the boards and pass off. And he did that. Billy Burwell was the star. And although Connie made All-City along with Roger Brennan. So even though everybody knew how good he was already, but he was patient enough to just pass off, clean the boards, and then of course the senior year he dominated. They won a second high school championship, the Public Schools Athletic League they called it. So by the time he left for Iowa,
before it goes there, we need to talk about one thing.
Okay.
We got to slow down and mention one key factor there, right? He plays in the Parade All-American game. Which,
well, yes. You're right. Thank you. Yes.
Let's talk about that because that's a good segue to talk about how great he was in inserting his dominance and coming into with his own and showing that what level of where he was at and how he was able to dominate at so many levels because wherever he went, he did the same thing. And it's so he shows up at maybe, halftime?
Well, no. This is a great story. It was first of all, your great grandmother insisted that Connie go to his high school graduation. Now, why in the world their high school graduation was so late in June? It was actually June 29th. Was the day of this game at Roosevelt Stadium in New Jersey. It was actually outdoors. But your great grandma insisted that Connie go to his high school graduation. So
was
brother, I think Randy, I don't know which brother was waiting. So as soon as it ended,
it was actually Earl.
Earl, okay. Earl. They got in the car, and the newspaper, the exaggerated stories say he got there at halftime. He actually got there late in the first quarter. All right.
But it took him a while, but he didn't start playing until halftime because he didn't have nothing. He didn't have shoes.
He forgot his shoes.
He didn't have a uniform or shorts. Or any shoes. So he ends up borrowing some stuff from just some random person in the crowd in the stands that kind of matched up with him and had a similar size. So he borrows somebody's stuff and ends up, his team was losing before that time. He comes out and at the end he gets player of the game, MVP
of the game.
And comes back and the team wins.
Yeah. Now he played with, Jeff Mullins was in that game. Paul Silas was in that game. John Thompson, who later coached at Georgetown. Tom was in that game. It's still considered one of the most famous high school all-star games in history to this day. I mean, it's of legend. It really is.
Yeah. And so that's one of those things that where it lets you know that where he was destined to be great. He was just, going able to go out and do Rutgers, same thing as a kid. He was young. He was out there dominating. And there was guys that were already playing at a college level or playing at a professional level that was out there, and he was dominating those guys, being able to hold his own. And when you're able to do that, a lot of people, your name's going to get around.
He was being compared to Oscar Robertson and Wilt Chamberlain.
Yep.
So imagine that. A guard and a center.
All in one.
Because he could do everything.
Literally. So you figure he was those Magics, before Magic, those guys that, those hybrids, those guys that are 6'8", 6'9", that can dribble, pass, shoot, could do everything, can affect the game in more than one way versus a guy that just can score the basketball and that's it, and they need the ball in their hand and ball dominant. Is a guy that can play off the ball, can get other people involved, can bring it up, can, assist, can facilitate, and was a guy can score for himself too if he needed to, or rebound to, get somebody else involved also.
Yeah, virtually at that time, there was nobody else 6'8" who could have literally been a point guard. Mm-hmm. That was what made him so different.
Yep.
And he got those kind of comments, even though he didn't play actual game. I mean, he played when he was a freshman at Iowa. Some of the team that they played were like other Big Ten freshman teams, but not all of them. Some of them were just alumni kind of games. The Iowa alumni come in and they played before the varsity game. Mm-hmm. But even guys like John Kuhnla, who was the coach of the University of Minnesota, had been the coach of the Minneapolis Lakers. He said he made comments about how Connie could be a point guard. Mm-hmm. Or he could play all three positions. Yep. And, there was some, like Oscar Robertson wasn't as tall, of course. Oscar Robertson was a good enough player to play center, but there weren't centers that could play guard. And Connie was that very, very rare person that actually could.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So yeah, I'm glad you remembered that game.
Yeah. Cute little tidbit.
Yeah, that's a great tidbit.
Yeah.
Thanks for remembering.
Oh, I got you.
Well, he obviously he started in high school. He was a great high school player. Finds his way out to Iowa, plays his freshman year there, but he gets caught up in this scandal. And again, could do a whole show on the scandal. Don't want to get too sidetracked on it because we want to talk and celebrate his career. So he plays at Iowa for the 1 year, and then he's kicked off the team. Unfairly kicked off the team. So I want to jump ahead, though. Because again, we're going to celebrate his career today. Mark, who were the Pittsburgh Rens, and how did Connie find his way to the Pittsburgh Rens?
Thank you for asking that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, the Pittsburgh Rens were in the American Basketball League. In one of my my chapter right after Connie is Iowa boots him, he went back to New York. Now, a lot of guys who were great at Rucker Park got, as I term it, got swallowed up by the streets, drugs and such. But Connie, maybe the most remarkable story of his whole career is one you don't really hear about, is how he made it through the summer. He played at Rucker Park. He played against Wilt Chamberlain. And it was some good luck. Connie had some really bad luck, but there was some good luck that happened too, because that was the summer that Abe Saperstein, the guy who ran the Harlem Globetrotters for 30-some years up to that point, he was pissed off at the NBA because the NBA didn't give him a team. And he's the guy that really saved the NBA through the 1950s. He was scheduled the Harlem Globetrotters to play doubleheaders with NBA teams. Otherwise, the NBA might have withered away. It just wasn't that popular in the 50s. So he should have gotten a team in either Chicago or Los Angeles. He actually did. He actually was awarded a team in the 50s in Chicago, but the NBA gave him no help, and he said, screw it. So anyway, he really should have gotten a team later. Either LA, they were very reluctant to move there. The NBA was very reluctant to go to the West Coast. And when they didn't go in 1960, that was sort of Abe Saperstein's final straw. He had been threatening to start a new league since 1959, but in May of 1960, he said, yep, I'm going to do it. And so the summer of 1961 is when they kicked it off. Well, that was right after Connie had left Iowa. So it was great timing. The coach of the Rens, Neil Johnston, and the owner, Lenny Littman, and their trainer, Alex Medich, who is a character. He was also the trainer for the Pipers. They knew about Connie, And so they got word. Lenny Littman out of the blue called him one day towards the end of the summer. And Connie was getting a little distressed by this point because his two buddies, Eddie Simmons and Jackie Jackson, went back to college, and he was, late August or whatever, left alone, wondering what he's going to do. But he did get a call from Lenny Littman, the owner of the Rens. He went to Pittsburgh for a tryout. They signed him, and he became the most valuable player, leading scorer of the American Basketball League the first season. Now, some people might turn up their nose and say, well, it was just the American Basketball League and et cetera. Well, Larry Brown will argue with you on that point, for one person. Larry Brown, actually, the guy who coached every team on the planet, and actually played against him in New York growing up. But he said the American Basketball League, that don't call it a minor league. It definitely wasn't a minor league. It had several ex-NBA players. And so Connie goes there as a scrawny 19-year-old, only weighed about 160 pounds at 6'8".
Of which, let's add that those guys tried to consistently, the neck was because he was so, Pharrell was the physically, get beat him up, basically. So every night in, night out, he was dealing with that, that type of, that was their objective. That was their way. That was a strategy. Like, okay, yeah, he's young. Pharrell just came in the league. We're going to beat him up. We're going to put some bodies on him. So I just wanted to add that.
No, that's a
he was so
because
he was so young. He was so young, and they tried to physical him so much. He holds the the 1 game point scoring record. He scored 54 points in 1 game.
Yeah.
Wow, did they physical him?
You did your research. Wow, yeah. Well, here's the great. So the AB. Okay. So muggings were legal, pretty much. The referees were mediocre at best. And Kenny Sears was one of the ABL players. He played for the San Francisco Saints. Or I'm saying he was a former NBA player playing for in the ABL that year. And he another thing that made it so difficult was he talked about how in the NBA there was sort of a gentleman's agreement not to kill each other, right? So yeah, he wasn't playing against Wilt Chamberlain or Bill Russell or people like that, because he was playing against a young studs who wanted to kill him every night. Plus the ABL, so literally the Rens, they played 5 different times. They played 5 games in a row on 5 nights. They had one stretch where they played 9 games straight. Every day, 9 straight days they played. And then there was another, I think, 4 games in a row. So it was a brutal, brutal schedule. And they do things like, Pittsburgh and Cleveland actually had a little rivalry, the Cleveland Pipers and the Pittsburgh Rens. A lot of times, right after the game, they'd get in a rental car and then drive back to Pittsburgh or go to Chicago in snowstorms. So the idea that he led the league, I think it was 27.5 points per game. He finished second in rebound. I think he was a 10th of a rebound behind Bill Bridges, who won the rebounding title. But here's the kicker. They almost won the ABL championship. So there, we know he went off to the Pipers and won the ABA championship, right? Well, he almost did the same thing that first year in the ABL. What the ABL did was they had 2 halves. They had a first half, then they had a champion. They played the playoffs for the championship the first half, then they played the second half.
Oh, okay. 2 half seasons.
Yeah. So they finished 1 game behind Cleveland, and Cleveland was their rival. And by the way, the Cleveland Pipers were owned by George Steinbrenner, just to make it interesting. But they finished 1 game behind. The crazy thing about it that was Cleveland got to play 7 of their last 8 games of the first half at home, while the Pipers went on an 8-game road trip. They played in Detroit, then they went to LA, then they played 5 games.
You mean the Rens went on an 8?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did I say Pipers?
You mean the Rens went on an 8?
The Rens.
Yeah.
The Rens. So they went to Detroit, went to LA. They played 5 games in Hawaii. Then they flew back to the West Coast and played in San Francisco. So they had that brutal ending to the schedule. And so Cleveland got, they had the advantage. They could play at home, not travel during that last stretch. Well, Connie averaged 37 points a game on that road trip. He did everything in his power to get them to that first half championship, which is good to know because, he did the same thing with the Pipers in the playoffs later 6 years. So anyway, then the second half, they didn't do as well. But they still played in a playoff game. They had at the end, and Connie, I should know this number. It's right around 39 points. I think he scored in the one playoff game, but unfortunately lost. But anyway, but they had a terrible rebounding team, terrible defense. But despite all that, he almost dragged them over the finish line anyway.
Okay, this is where we ran into some technical difficulties. So for the rest of today's show, it'll just be Mark Whited and myself. Okay, Mark, so we had a little technical difficulty, and we're back now. Unfortunately, we don't have Sean with us, but that's okay. We're going to talk now a little bit more about Connie's road to the National Basketball Association. So we just talked about his time in the ABL with the Pittsburgh Rens. The ABL folds, goes away. Connie really has no place to go, and he winds up on the Harlem Globetrotters. How did he get to the Globetrotters? And I think more importantly than how did he get to the Globetrotters is how did the Harlem Globetrotters help him develop as a player and as a professional?
All right, so yes, he winds up with the Globetrotters. The ABL folded on December 31st, 1962. It lasted for 1 1/3 seasons. He wound up with the Harlem Globetrotters because the guy who owned the American Basketball League owned the Harlem Globetrotters, Abe Saperstein. So he picked Connie up right away. The NCAA wasn't going to let him play at Iowa. Well, that had been established a year and a half before that, but nobody had changed their mind on that. And of course, the NBA hadn't officially blackballed him yet, but Maurice Podoloff, the president of the NBA, pretty much made it clear on, around the bushes that, we're not going to let him in. Now, just before we get to the Globetrotters, so that year in the ABL where he won the scoring title, won the MVP, nearly led them to the ABL championship, that would have been his sophomore year at Iowa. Now, there's no question he would have made all Big Ten. And he would have been playing, he would have played Jerry Lucas and John Havlicek twice. They were both at Ohio State. And those games would have been the games of the century. They would have been big time covered. And so anyway, he didn't get to do that. And he would have also probably made second or third team all NCAA, All American. I'm sorry, second or third team All American. So then he was there for the Rens for that second season. It got cut short. Well, that should have been his junior season at Iowa. And he would have almost definitely made first team All-American. And he might have been the player of the year as a junior. Ironically, the guy who won player of the year was Art Heyman, who was the guy traded to the Pipers that made them a championship team. So I don't think there's any question he made first team All-American, might have been player of the year. So off he goes to the Globetrotters. 2 years into he probably played 1,000 games with the Globetrotters. That's a pretty good guess. They played a mad, crazy schedule, traveled all over the world, and he probably would have played 1,000 games. I haven't seen any video of him with the Globetrotters, unfortunately. My goodness, the things you would have been able to see if there was. But by 1965, which was 2 years into his time with the Globetrotters, he was already being called the greatest Globetrotter ever. And the Globetrotters started in 1927. So 38 years into the Globetrotters, he was called the best Globetrotter in history. So that's 1965. His lawyers that he had in Pittsburgh, meanwhile, had started their efforts to get him into the NBA in 1964, because in 1964, that was the first time the NBA passed over him. Well, if he had been able to play at Iowa the 63-64 season, that would have been his senior year. There's no question he would have been the player of the year. He would have been the number one pick of the NBA draft, no question about it, by the New York Knicks, ironically, the hometown team. How awesome would that have been? And meanwhile, at Iowa, they would have given Ohio State a run for their money that sophomore year of his, and they probably would have won the Big Ten his junior and senior year, because they would have been able to pull a couple guys. They would have been able to recruit better with Connie Hawkins there. They had Ira Harge, who later played for the Pipers, who later put New Mexico on the map because Connie left Iowa. They had Ira Harge in line to go to Iowa. So anyway, they would have had some studs at Iowa to make him better, and probably would have won the Big Ten his junior and senior year. So anyways, come 1966, that was his last year with the Globetrotters. He played for them for 3.5 years. So 1966, his lawyers wanted him to be back in Pittsburgh, back home, because 1966 is when they officially filed the suit against the NBA, the $6 million suit. Now, the funny thing happened with that. Pittsburgh in 1966, the NBA started to expand like mad in the late 60s. And of course, the ABA being founded in 1967 quickened their pace. So Pittsburgh was actually in line to get an NBA team in 1966 for the 67-68 season. Walter Kennedy came to a game in Pittsburgh in early November of 66. It was because there was 6 games scheduled NBA games scheduled in Pittsburgh by some people trying to get an NBA team there. Well, Kennedy was having a press conference, and he was talking about how wonderful Pittsburgh was, but then he got served papers, literally, by Connie Hawkins' lawyers. And suddenly, Pittsburgh wasn't such a great candidate for an NBA team. So thus, February 1967, the ABA gets formed, and Pittsburgh has a team. And since Connie Hawkins was already living in Pittsburgh because of the Rens and because he married Nancy while he was with the Rens. If he hadn't met Nancy and married her, if he'd gone back to New York, probably would have never heard from him again, because he wouldn't have been able to have the lawyers to be the dogs that catch the car, because they were the dog that caught the car. Nobody expected it to happen.
Did he have any apprehension at all in joining the ABA and the Pittsburgh Pipers? I mean, after all, he went to the ABL, it didn't succeed. He went to the Globetrotters, that's a fun team, it's not it's not the NBA. Oh gosh, now we have a new league, the ABA. Yeah, what the heck? I'll give it a try. Or
no, he didn't have any apprehension about the ABA. For one thing, he still wasn't making a lot of money. I mean, he was making Nancy had a big family, and the house he had in North Side was always full of Nancy's family. So he needed a job, and he was happy as hell to play basketball again. And so now, 2 years later, when he went to Phoenix in the NBA, yeah, he did kind of have some questions whether he'd be really good enough or not. I think just a natural sort of thing. Plus, he had injured his knee, but he really had no apprehension in starting with the ABA.
And he was the best. I mean, no exaggeration. He was the best player in the ABA when he was in the ABA.
Oh, for sure. I mean, so when he first started with the Pipers, 1967, the 67-68 season, he was no doubt, without question, the best player in the world not in the NBA. Okay. And so there was not a single player in the ABA didn't recognize it. He was the MVP for that 67-68 season, led them to a championship that it was especially the finals was just a classic 7-game series where they fell behind 2-1 and then they had to tie the series on the road twice. So that's kind of an unusual thing to be able to do that. That's hard to do. They were down 2-1 and then tied it in game 4 in New Orleans. And then they were down 3-2 and had to go down to New Orleans. And he was hurt. He got hurt in game 4. So they won game 4, but he got hurt so bad that he missed game 5. He couldn't play game 5. And then he was practically a cripple for game 6, but he willed them through and scored, I think, 41 points that night in game 6. And then game 7, they went back to Pittsburgh. He almost had a triple-double, and actually Charlie Williams scored 35 points and was, sort of the star of the game. They never were really threatened in game 7, and they drew a big crowd. It was the second biggest crowd they drew all season.
Did his style of play in the NBA, in the ABA, did his style of play have any influence on those around him as far as their style of play?
Well, a lot of times when you have a superstar around, the other players are in awe, sort of. So I think there was a little bit of that. Well, Connie will save us or whatever. But then again, they had a couple, their guards, they had Charlie Williams was all ABA guard, so he was the best guard in the league. The only problems the Pipers had in that championship season was this was, the 3-point shot was, well, actually they had it in the ABL too, but the NBA didn't have the 3-pointer at the time. The ABA introduced it again. And Charlie and Chico Vaughn, the other guards, sometimes you had to pull them back because they kind of fell in love with the 3-pointer, especially Chico Vaughn. But Charlie was a great defender. Actually, Chico and Charlie were both good defenders. Chico was an on and off kind of shooter. Charlie was a little more reliable shooter, a little better passer. But when they got Art Heyman in the trade with the New Jersey Americans, now the Brooklyn Nets, they were kind of blundering along at 11-12. They got him and went on a 15-game winning streak, then went 12-9, and went on a 12-game winning streak. So after they got Heyman, they started out 11-12. After they got Heyman, they went 43-12.
Wow.
And then swept the Indiana Pacers in the first round. Indiana had Roger Brown on the team. He's in the Hall of Fame now, and he was actually Connie's rival in high school in Brooklyn. So they went way back to Brooklyn days. Actually, they were the 2 best players coming out of high school in 1960. And then they beat Minnesota in 5 games. The only reason they didn't sweep them is game 2 was happening literally while Martin Luther King assassination riots were going on about a half a mile away from the Civic Arena. So the game shouldn't have been played that night. But anyway, they lost that game, but won the other 4. And then the series against New Orleans had Doug Moe and Larry Brown. And Minnesota had Mel Daniels. He's in the Hall of Fame. And then New Orleans, Larry Brown's in the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm. So after all this time, plays his freshman year at Iowa, Iowa State.
University of Iowa.
Right.
Iowa.
Plays his freshman year at Iowa. Why, doesn't get to play again for a while, goes to the ABL, becomes a Globetrotter, goes to the ABA. Finally, in 1969, Connie Hawkins is headed to the NBA. How did this come about?
Now, let's not forget, his second year in the ABA was in Minnesota.
Right. He went from, right, Pittsburgh moved to
They
Minnesota,
won their championship and then moved.
moved to
Yeah,
Minnesota. Then they came back to Pittsburgh after Minnesota. Right.
right. Yeah.
But he went from Pittsburgh to Minnesota, and then the NBA finally opened its doors and said, Connie, come on in. So why did the NBA finally allow Connie in? What happened there? And how did the Phoenix Suns acquire the rights to Connie Hawkins?
Okay, real quick. So in Minnesota, first year with the Pipers, MVP, scoring champion, finished second in rebounding. He was on the same path as second year. Rick Barry was his competition. Rick Barry was the closest to being as good as him. He was leading the league in scoring.
Yeah, over 30 points a game.
Yeah, he was over 30 points a game, but then he had a really bad injury at a practice. It wasn't even during a game. And so he should have missed the rest of the season. But they brought him back hoping he'd be able to help in the playoffs, and that didn't work out. But anyway, he was on his path to winning a second MVP, second scoring championship, and he really shouldn't have come back because he was really never the same. So despite never being the same, he's all NBA his first year in the NBA with Phoenix Suns. But now it came about quickly because Connie's lawyers started in 1964 trying to get him back in. They officially filed the suit in 1966. Walter Kennedy was being very arrogant and dismissive of the whole thing. He was the NBA commissioner. He wasn't, he just assumed that Connie did something he shouldn't have and never really personally looked into it. Well, while the lawyers were doing their thing, David Wolf, a guy who actually did more boxing writing than basketball writing, got interested in Connie, and he actually lived with Connie for about 4 months while he was with the Minnesota Pipers. And so David Wolf at first thought, he kind of was thinking, well, Connie probably did something, you know what I mean? And so they made an agreement that he told Connie Hawkins, he said, look, if I believe you, but if I find something that says, you're not telling the truth about this, I'll say it, but it was almost like a two-pronged approach. His lawyers were doing what digging they could, and they were dealing with the New York District Attorney's Office. And so David Wolf was doing digging too, and they were kind of working, not really as a team, but they were sort of exchanging information. And so Connie finished his season with the Pipers in April of 68. Then I always forget, it was either late May or early June, he published a Life magazine article about the Connie Hawkins story. Well, a few weeks later, the NBA realized the jig was up. And actually, the person who ironically realized it was one of Walter Kennedy's lawyers, David Stern, who later became commissioner, right? And later, in 1996, he failed to do something, which is kind of ironic or sad. But anyway, he's the one that told Walter Kennedy, look, he's right. He didn't have anything to do with this scandal. We need to let him back in. So in 1969, that happened to be also the summer that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was going into the NBA.
Alcindor at that time, Lou Alcindor.
Yeah, right. Lou Alcindor. Right. Thank you. Right. And so, and by the way, George Mikan totally hosed that up. George Mikan is the guy that made Pittsburgh move to Minnesota after winning a championship.
Yeah, he was the commissioner of the ABA.
He was a commissioner of the ABA the first 2 years. He did a great job at first. Like him being the commissioner at first was the greatest thing in the world for the ABA. But then he should have gone home after a couple months because he gave them some credibility because, he was the first superstar in the NBA.
Yeah.
But he insisted on the offices being in Minneapolis. He didn't want to move to New York. So
Well, the whole weird thing about it too is you had the Pittsburgh Pipers. I forget the name of the team in Minnesota, but there was a team in Minnesota.
Minnesota Muskies.
The Minnesota Muskies. They moved the Muskies out of there. They moved Pittsburgh up there. Makes no sense.
Because Pittsburgh didn't draw that well, but guess what? Minnesota drew a lot worse. So the Minnesota Muskies, they won't move to Miami. And Mike sweetened the pot for Gabe Rubin, the owner of the Pipers, to move to Minnesota. It was stupid. It was crazy.
Yeah.
And obviously it was proved because they moved back the year
later.
Yeah. So anyway, so Lou Alcindor, he wanted to play in the ABA for the Nets. But Mike screwed that up. He had a meeting because Lou Alcindor said, look, I'm going to give the NBA one a chance, the ABA a chance, each make an offer to me, and that's it. There's not going to be any negotiating. So when Mikan went to his meeting with Alcindor, he had a check in his pocket, $1 million check. He failed to produce the check at the meeting. Alcindor, because Alcindor was from New York. He wanted to go back to New York.
Yeah.
He had no desire to be in Milwaukee.
Right. And that was proved just a couple of years later.
Right. So then what happened was there was two big coin flips that summer. Phoenix and Milwaukee flipped a coin to see who would get the first pick of the draft. That would so if Phoenix would have won the coin flip,
I thought it was Seattle.
That's the second coin flip.
Oh, okay.
The first coin flip was Phoenix versus Milwaukee to get the first pick of the draft. First pick of the draft was obviously going to be Alcindor. And to this day, Jerry Colangelo, the guy who owned the Phoenix Suns for a long time, still kicks himself about that coin flip. Because instead of picking it himself, he let the fan, he had like a fan drawing or whatever, a fan input. And so he went with that and regrets it to this day. Gosh. Anyway, so then, a few weeks later, then Connie becomes available. So the coin flip was between Phoenix and Seattle.
Okay.
So he might have become a Seattle Supersonic, but Phoenix won that.
And I mean, what a great thing for Phoenix. I mean, what a great rookie season he had. I mean, he averaged over 24 and a half points per game, almost 5 assists per game, over 10 rebounds per game. But wasn't rookie of the year. That went to Lou Alcindor. How can you argue that? Yeah, pretty. If you're going to lose, all right, well, I lost out to Lou Alcindor. I mean, no shame there. But how good was Connie Hawkins his rookie year in the NBA? And how easy was it for him to adapt to the NBA style of game?
The only reason he really had a hard time adapting was he was still recovering from that knee injury. So the first third of the season, he really kind of stumbled along. And the teammates were wondering, this guy, he was supposed to be so great. And the coach was getting impatient. And they realized how good he was, but it took a while. So you just said his stats. If he hadn't had the injury and would have been able to go into that, hit the hardwood running, we'll say, he would have had even much better stats. Mm-hmm. But he really was, and he did have some uncertainty mentally because of that knee really maybe even psyched him out more than it should have. Mm-hmm. But and as he later admitted, but he said he really did have he had a difficult time at first, but he came on, and then when they played that first round of the playoffs, and mind you, the Phoenix Suns were terrible the first year. Then the second year, they make the playoffs, and they take the LA Lakers, who had Wilt Chamberlain, Jerry West, and Elgin Baylor on the team, and he led them to a 3-1 lead. Unfortunately, they couldn't hang on and close it out and they lost in 7 games.
How integral was he to their success?
And he outplayed Wilt, and he outplayed Elgin Baylor. Now Jerry West was played out of his mind. Jerry West is really who won that series, but he outscored Wilt. Wilt out rebounded him, but Paul Silas was doing a lot of the rebounding work for the Suns that year. So Connie was, he led him that far in his first year. It should have been his 6th year in the NBA, but of course it was only his first. And he, like, his first team All NBA. That's very important. And that makes you think, okay, let me see, 6th year in what, almost, he gets to the NBA kind of at the end of his prime. He's injured. He still makes All NBA. Well, that makes you wonder, well, what would he have done those first 5 years in the NBA?
Yeah, sure.
Well, he certainly would have won Rookie of the Year. Willis Reed won it that year. But if Connie Hawkins had been drafted in 1964, he would have been the Rookie of the Year, period.
Sure.
Willis Reed wouldn't, Willis Reed passed last year, but Willis Reed wouldn't have argued with you on that. In fact, actually, if they should have been teammates, because Willis Reed was picked in the 2nd round of the 64 draft. So
if Connie had gone in the 1st round, you would have had Connie and Willis playing for the Knicks.
Right. That would have been incredible.
Connie really did have a terrific NBA career, and in his 5 full years with the Suns, he averaged over 20 points a game, over 3 assists a game, over 9 rebounds a game. He had all-star appearances. Just how good was he with Phoenix?
Well, like you say, he's still his 2nd and 3rd years. He made the All-Star team his first 4 years in the NBA. In his 2nd and 3rd years, he had almost as good a years as that first year. But the 2nd and 3rd year, he got screwed by the playoff format. The NBA expanded, and they went from 2 divisions to 4. I guess it was 4. But so what happened was you had the first 2 teams in each division making the playoffs. Well, Phoenix happened to be in a tougher division. They finished 3rd in their division with a great record.
Yeah.
And the Atlanta Hawks, they had the good fortune to be in a crappy division. So they finished, I think their winning percentage was 439. They made the playoffs. Phoenix was, I know, 598 the second year they got screwed. The first year they were like at 570, something like that. But they had 2 very good seasons in a row, but he didn't get to shine in the playoffs. And that really, one of the 3, him not being able to play in the playoffs his 2nd and 3rd year in the NBA really hurt his forever, what people think of him. Like I was ranting when we talked the other day. He's not in David Aldridge's top 100 book, and he's not on Bill Simmons' latest top 100. That's a joke. Yeah. And I respect the heck out of those 2 guys. They knew more basketball than I could ever know. But like most people, they just don't know how good he was. And when you try and put the argument, oh, well, he was only in the NBA 7 years. Well, gee, why was he only in the NBA? Because the NBA unjustly blackballed him. And anyway.
Yeah. So why did the Suns get rid of him?
He was starting to fade.
Deteriorate.
He really was. His last year, they traded him to the Lakers. He just wasn't the same. His points per game went down, but his rebounds, that's really, if you look at his, you're looking at it now, but
yeah,
his rebounds per game dropped off
down. I mean,
quite a bit.
His years in the NBA: 10.4, 9.1, 8.3, 8.5, 7.2, 5.4, 7.4, 4.6, and then 6. And those last years, with LA and Atlanta were really, he didn't play. So,
and he didn't make in 1996. Here's sort of.
Let me get there. He didn't.
Okay, you got okay.
He didn't. He missed so much time. His early years, age 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. didn't get to play in the NBA. Mark, in our early conversations as we prepared for today's show, we talked about the fact that he wasn't named to a lot of all-time teams, and you have some very, very strong opinions about that. Tell us about that.
So I have 13 chapters in my book about Connie Hawkins, and the last chapter I called Disappearing the Hawk. So obviously, the New York District Attorney's Office, they should have never even bothered him, dragged him into something he had nothing to do with. Then, of course, the University of Iowa, they panicked and forced him to quit, expel. They didn't technically expel him, they forced him to quit. And then the NBA, of course, blackballed him. Now, that, and of course, the NBA could have fixed things in 1964 and made it so Iowa and DA's office, what they did, maybe, at least would have been in the rearview mirror. But so, fortunately, now in 1992, there was a gentleman in Pittsburgh named Jim O'Brien who pretty much led his case to the Hall of Fame and he did get in the Hall of Fame, fortunately. But in 1996, the NBA came out with their 50 at 50 list. And that was only the third time they actually had sort of an official sanctioned top NBA. There's if you go on the internet, you can see hundreds of top 100, top 50, top whatever lists. But the 1996 list was the third time the NBA came out with a real list that they sanctioned, and it was it was 1996, and that was when the NBA or the internet was really first starting. In 1971, they had come out with the 25-year point, the top 10 players ever. It was a little bit of it really wasn't a great list because they didn't include active players. So the Jerry West and guys like that weren't on it. But the 1980 list at the 35-year point was the top 11. That was a real legitimate, no kidding list. I mean, it had Bob Pettit, it had Bob Cousy, George Mikan, Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, Bill Russell, Elgin Baylor, Kareem, John Havlicek, and Dr. J. Now, really, that was supposed to be a top 10 list, but they made it 11 because they wanted to put Dr. J on there. Fine. So, 1996, they come out with the 50 at 50. Well, the guy who was the commissioner at the time was David Stern.
Stearns.
And it was a lot of, the idea that Connie Hawkins wasn't, several people, Tony Kornheiser, people like that wrote, what in the world how in the world could you leave Connie Hawkins off the list? He was Dr. J before Dr. J. He was Dr. J with a jump shot. He was one of the four, the Mount Rushmore of high flyers. That Mount Rushmore is Elgin Baylor, Connie Hawkins, Dr. J, Michael Jordan. When he was in high school, he was compared to Oscar Robertson and Wilt Chamberlain, and was compared to those two guys all the way through till the day he went into the NBA. So then you're going to tell me, and then he's all NBA his first year in the NBA. He probably would have been, at least at the very worst, his first years of the NBA, first 5 years, he would have been Rookie of the Year, and he would have been no worse than second team all NBA. He might have been first team all five, at least 3 or 4 years. So then to tell you, so in 1996, he's not in the 50 at 50. Now, why is that so bad? Well, yeah, it's great he's in the Hall of Fame, but who remembers people in the Hall of Fame? Yeah. Al Serby, anyone?
Yeah.
But those top lists, the 50 at 50, well, guess what? When they made the 75 at 75 list, what did they do? They took that top 50 at 50 list and went from there pretty much, right? And when they do the top 100 at 100, they'll take the top 75.
Right. Yeah.
So what you have then is people like Bill Simmons and David Aldrich, who are no a heck of a lot of
Great
basketball.
historians.
If he'd have been on that 50-50 list, he'd be in their books, but so not being on that 50-50 effectively removed him from the public consciousness. Even though there's so many people, even the old timers, who realize how good he was, but they even don't really know how good he was. So him being left off at 50-50 was real bad for his, being for being in the NBA history of all time.
It's such a shame because you can look in almost each sport and just find one or two guys that were just so severely affected by something totally out of their control and had such an effect on their career. But Connie Hawkins might take the cake. I mean,
let me read you a quote from Tony Kornheiser.
Sure.
He said, "I am prejudiced toward people who moved the game along. I am prejudiced toward people who thrilled with their flash. That's why my top 50 absolutely positively has to have Connie Hawkins. The lineage of hang time begins with Elgin Baylor, then passes through Hawkins, Julius Erving, and Thompson before it gets to Michael Jordan. If you connect the dots, you'll see the evolution of the soaring improvisational jazz of basketball." That's a really good quote.
Yeah.
And it describes how he was as a player. It covers a lot of ground in that one quote. But,
yeah. It's a shame too, because as you also point out in your book, that there's just, until he got to the NBA, there's just not a lot of footage out there of Connie Hawkins, so people can go back and say, wait, who's this? What are you telling me he was that good? Well, you can't even go back and take a look at how good he was and how he flew above the rim. And as Sean said, his hands were so big. He
11.5 inches.
The way he could grab a ball and just like ball's going out of bounds and he could palm it and grab it back from. I mean, the guy was just a phenom. He was a superstar, and just what happened to him was so unjust.
It absolutely was. It shouldn't have happened. And I think I said earlier in the podcast that I challenge anybody to come up with an athlete who at the age of 19 had a trajectory that was as guaranteed, and then had a deprivation, or whatever you want to call it, lost opportunity as bad as his was.
Yeah, because most of the guys who were on that trajectory probably did something to themselves to cause them to have that trajectory go like this.
Well, right. And it wasn't anything he did.
Was anything he should have been going like this, and this, and we should be considering Connie Hawkins on those all-time great lists, and much more focus should be on what a great career he had, but it's not, because he missed so much time and it wasn't his fault. Hey man, we've really exhausted a lot of time on here. We could talk more about Connie, more about the Pipers, and I think I will invite you back. No, I will invite you back, because I do want to explore the scandal in much more detail. So, yeah. Mark, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
You're welcome.
In the ABA, Connie Hawkins averaged 28.2 points per game to go along with 12.6 rebounds per game and 4.3 assists per game. In the NBA, he scored at a clip of 16.5 points per game, 8 rebounds a game, and 4.1 assists per game. When you combine it all together, Connie Hawkins averaged 18.7 points per game, 9 rebounds a game, and 4.3 assists per game. As the saying goes, oh, what could have been. Hey, thanks again to my guest today, author Mark Whited, and the grandson of Connie Hawkins, Sean Hawkins, and thanks to all of you for watching, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.